It started with a single amendment to the coronation seating plan quietly inserted into a red leather folder just hours before the state banquet began. It started with a single amendment to the coronation seating plan quietly inserted into a red leather folder just hours before the state banquet began. Most guests never noticed it, but Catherine did. And when the Princess of Wales rose from her seat and walked out beneath the chandeliers of Buckingham Palace, even veteran palace aides realized something catastrophic had just unfolded. What made the moment so explosive was not the sound of confrontation, because there was none. No raised voices, no public argument, only a silence so sudden and unnatural that it seemed to spread across the banquet hall in seconds, moving from one table to another as senior diplomats, aristocrats, foreign representatives, and palace officials slowly realized the future Queen of Britain had just abandoned one of the most carefully choreographed royal evenings of the year. Reports suggest Buckingham Palace had spent weeks preparing for the state banquet, knowing the event carried unusual political and symbolic importance during a period when King Charles III's health continued to generate whispers behind palace walls. Every guest placement, every ceremonial detail, every line of protocol had reportedly been reviewed repeatedly by royal aides desperate to avoid embarrassment or instability. Catherine herself had allegedly taken a direct interest in portions of the arrangement, particularly those connected to precedence and future ceremonial positioning inside the monarchy. That was why insiders now claimed the discovery hit with such devastating force. According to various interpretations of the evening, Catherine had been reviewing the final ceremonial structure only moments before dinner service officially began when she noticed a subtle but highly significant adjustment within the coronation framework attached to the banquet protocols. Camilla's role had reportedly been elevated beyond what Catherine and William previously understood had been agreed upon during earlier discussions surrounding the monarchy's long-term future. Sources close to palace administrative circles suggest the adjustment had been approved personally by Charles in the final hours before the banquet, bypassing several layers of consultation that would normally involve William and Catherine directly. At first, aides allegedly attempted to dismiss the change as a minor ceremonial clarification, but witnesses now whisper that Catherine immediately understood the deeper meaning behind it. This was not simply about seating arrangements or symbolic titles. This was about influence, legacy, visibility, power. Insiders claim Catherine's expression changed almost instantly after reading the revised protocol notes, with one palace figure allegedly describing her reaction as controlled devastation. What happened next reportedly sent staff members into panic behind the scenes. Palace aides began moving rapidly between rooms. Conversations became fragmented, and senior courtiers were suddenly seen abandoning diplomatic guests to gather near private corridors inside Buckingham Palace. Yet, despite the growing tension, Catherine reportedly said very little. That silence would become one of the most talked about details of the entire evening. Witnesses claim she calmly closed the folder, stood from her place at the banquet preparations, and quietly exited the room while stunned officials watched in disbelief. For several long moments, nobody followed her. Even William reportedly remained frozen behind, trying to understand exactly what had triggered such an extraordinary reaction from his wife. Different interpretations suggest he only grasped the severity of the situation after reviewing the amended protocol himself moments later. By then, however, the damage had already begun spreading through palace corridors like wildfire. Senior royal staff allegedly started contacting one another immediately, fearful that the situation represented something much larger than a temporary disagreement. Because inside the House of Windsor, symbolism is never accidental. And those closest to the institution understood instantly that Catherine's departure carried a message far more dangerous than public anger ever could have. For months, palace officials treated the revised coronation framework like a classified state document. Different interpretations of internal meetings suggest even some senior royals were denied full access to the final ceremonial structure. And according to insiders, Catherine only discovered the truth by accident. By the time she walked out of Buckingham Palace that evening, whispers had already begun spreading through royal corridors that the state banquet controversy was merely the visible surface of a much deeper power struggle unfolding behind closed doors. Reports suggest the revised coronation planning had been evolving quietly for months under the direction of King Charles III as part of his broader effort to reshape the monarchy into what advisors allegedly described as a modern institution prepared for a changing Britain. Publicly, the idea sounded harmless, even necessary. But within palace walls, insiders now claim the discussions surrounding modernization became entangled with a far more dangerous question: how much influence Queen Camilla would ultimately hold inside the future structure of the crown. Sources familiar with palace administrative circles whisper that several senior royals grew increasingly uncomfortable as Camilla's ceremonial presence expanded beyond what many traditionalists believed Queen Elizabeth II had carefully intended during her lifetime. According to various interpretations of private meetings, there had always been an unspoken understanding that the monarchy's future public identity would gradually transition toward William and Catherine as the central stabilizing force of the institution. Catherine herself reportedly believed that balance had already been quietly established after years of duty, sacrifice, and relentless public pressure placed upon her family. That belief, insiders now say, may explain why the revised coronation framework felt less like a procedural adjustment and more like a devastating betrayal. Different interpretations suggest portions of the revised ceremonial order elevated Camilla's long-term symbolic position in ways that altered not only public precedents, but the emotional hierarchy inside the House of Windsor itself. To outsiders, the changes may have appeared subtle, but within royal culture, symbolism carries enormous weight. A title placement, a ceremonial role, even the sequence of appearances during state functions can quietly signal who truly holds influence behind palace gates. And according to palace whispers, Catherine immediately recognized that the revisions implied something larger than ceremonial protocol. They implied permanence. Royal historians allegedly began comparing the situation to earlier succession-era tensions that once fractured previous generations of the monarchy, moments where public appearances concealed fierce internal battles over legitimacy, loyalty, and control. Some insiders reportedly drew parallels to the difficult years following King Edward VIII's abdication, while others referenced the emotional fractures that emerged during the breakdown of Charles and Diana's marriage decades earlier. Yet, what made this crisis uniquely explosive was timing. Charles's ongoing health concerns had already intensified anxiety surrounding the monarchy's future direction since early 2024, meaning every internal shift now carried heightened political and emotional significance. Palace administrative streams reportedly indicate the debate over Camilla's expanded ceremonial role had continued for weeks behind closed doors, with aides divided over how much visibility the queen consort should maintain as preparations for the monarchy's next chapter quietly accelerated. Some courtiers allegedly feared the changes would undermine the carefully balanced image Queen Elizabeth II spent decades protecting. Others argued Charles had every right to elevate the woman who stood beside him through years of public humiliation and personal turmoil. But insiders now claim Catherine viewed the matter through an entirely different lens. According to sources close to the palace, she interpreted the move not simply as a political adjustment, but as the dismantling of long-standing understandings that had shaped the future expectations of William's direct family line for years. That realization reportedly transformed private disappointment into something far colder and far more dangerous: distrust. And as whispers spread through Buckingham Palace corridors that evening, another realization began to emerge. Someone had deliberately kept Catherine in the dark until the very last moment. According to various interpretations of that night, William did not immediately chase after Catherine. Instead, the future king reportedly stood motionless beside the banquet table, staring at the revised protocol papers while conversations around him slowly collapsed into silence. For several long seconds, insiders claimed nobody inside the room truly understood what had just happened. Diplomats continued speaking in lowered voices. Palace aides attempted to maintain composure. Members of the royal household reportedly exchanged uncertain glances across the hall, each waiting for someone else to explain why the Princess of Wales had abruptly abandoned one of the monarchy's most important state occasions. But according to sources close to palace staff, William's expression reportedly revealed the truth before any official explanation ever could. Different interpretations suggest he had not fully understood the extent of the coronation revisions until the exact moment Catherine reacted to them. Palace insiders whisper that while earlier discussions surrounding modernization had certainly taken place, William allegedly believed clear boundaries still existed regarding ceremonial hierarchy and future positioning inside the institution. The realization that key details may have been deliberately withheld from both him and Catherine reportedly struck with devastating force. One former royal correspondent later claimed the atmosphere inside Buckingham Palace shifted instantly from confusion into fear because those closest to the monarchy understood exactly what this moment implied. This was no longer a disagreement over protocol. This was becoming a crisis of trust at the very center of the crown itself. Reports suggest William quietly gathered the revised documents before stepping away from the banquet area and disappearing into a nearby private room with several senior aides. What followed behind those closed doors has since become the subject of intense palace speculation. Sources familiar with internal staff conversations describe panic behind closed doors, with aides allegedly scrambling to explain who approved the revisions, when the adjustments were finalized, and why Catherine had not been informed sooner. Different interpretations claim William's frustration was not explosive but controlled in a way many found even more unsettling. According to insiders, he reportedly demanded direct answers about how such a significant symbolic alteration had been hidden until the final hours before the banquet. Meanwhile, the public side of the evening continued hanging together by a thread. King Charles III allegedly attempted to calm tensions while guests remained seated, aware that even the smallest visible sign of royal instability could trigger international headlines by morning. Palace officials reportedly worked frantically to keep the disruption contained, quietly redirecting conversations and encouraging attendees to remain focused on the diplomatic purpose of the evening. Yet, despite those efforts, insiders claimed the emotional fracture had already become impossible to conceal entirely. Camilla, according to various interpretations, maintained remarkable composure throughout the growing turmoil, continuing her public duties while whispers spread rapidly through palace corridors around her. But sources suggest even some of her allies recognized the situation was spiraling beyond ceremonial politics into something far more personal and dangerous. Because beneath the arguments over precedence and modernization lurked an older conflict, the monarchy had never fully escaped the battle between bloodline and influence, tradition and adaptation, loyalty and survival. By the time William finally emerged from the private discussions, insiders claimed the emotional distance between the royal factions had become unmistakable. Witnesses later reported that William and Catherine departed Buckingham Palace separately from the main royal group, avoiding the carefully managed exits normally designed to project unity and stability. That detail alone reportedly sent palace staff into deeper alarm. Within hours, royal commentators and journalists allegedly began hearing fragmented whispers about a serious internal rupture involving the future direction of the monarchy. Some insiders even claimed the evening exposed fractures that had existed quietly for years beneath the polished surface of the firm before the family. Because behind the formal titles, ceremonial smiles, and carefully rehearsed appearances, a devastating realization was now spreading through the House of Windsor itself. The future king and the current king may no longer fully trust the same people. Reports suggest the revised coronation structure wasn't merely ceremonial housekeeping. According to palace insiders, it represented something far more consequential, a quiet expansion of Queen Camilla's long-term institutional influence during a moment when King Charles's health remained under constant scrutiny. By the time Catherine left Buckingham Palace that evening, many within royal circles allegedly understood the controversy had evolved beyond hurt feelings or protocol disagreements. What was unfolding now touched the deepest fears inside the modern monarchy, uncertainty over who truly controlled the future direction of the crown. While the king's physical condition remained a subject of growing anxiety behind palace walls since early 2024, whispers surrounding Charles's health had reportedly transformed the atmosphere inside the royal household into one of permanent tension. Public appearances were analyzed relentlessly. Scheduling adjustments triggered speculation. Even minor procedural changes inside palace operations allegedly carried heightened significance because courtiers understood the monarchy had quietly entered a transition era, whether anyone was prepared to admit it publicly or not. According to various interpretations from royal insiders, that fragile environment created an opening for influence struggles that would normally remain hidden beneath decades of ceremonial discipline. And increasingly, sources claim Camilla's role inside palace operations began expanding far beyond traditional expectations associated with a queen consort. Different interpretations suggest she became deeply involved in what some staff members allegedly described as domestic diplomacy, the invisible management of relationships, loyalties, access, and influence within the institution itself. Palace aides reportedly noticed shifts in who attended private discussions, who gained proximity to Charles, and which advisors suddenly carried greater authority behind closed doors. None of it appeared dramatic publicly. That was precisely what made insiders so uneasy because within royal systems, power rarely announces itself loudly. It moves quietly through access, trust, and positioning. According to sources familiar with Catherine's thinking, the Princess of Wales had become increasingly concerned not only about the monarchy's public image, but about preserving what she allegedly viewed as the carefully balanced legacy structure established during Queen Elizabeth II's reign. Catherine reportedly believed the late Queen spent decades stabilizing the institution by ensuring the monarchy's future would eventually consolidate clearly around William and his immediate family line. To Catherine, insiders whisper, The revised coronation structure appeared to challenge that delicate balance in ways that carried enormous long-term consequences. Reports suggest members of the Royal Old Guard quietly shared similar concerns. Certain courtiers, long-serving advisors, and traditionalist figures inside palace circles allegedly viewed William and Catherine as the safest path toward preserving public trust during a period of extraordinary instability. Different interpretations even claimed some palace veterans had already begun informally preparing for William's eventual reign, strengthening alliances around the future Prince and Princess of Wales. While Charles's health struggles continued casting uncertainty over the institution, that growing divide reportedly created an increasingly tense atmosphere behind palace walls. On one side stood loyalists determined to support Charles and Camilla fully during a vulnerable chapter in the king's life. On the other stood figures focused less on the present monarch and more on safeguarding the monarchy's future after him. According to insiders, Camilla's allies allegedly pushed aggressively for greater ceremonial prominence precisely because they understood time and public visibility mattered. The more institutional authority attached to Camilla now, the more difficult it would become for future royal leadership to quietly reduce her influence later. That realization reportedly struck Catherine with devastating clarity the moment she saw the revised ceremonial order because from her perspective this was not merely about a banquet, a coronation detail, or palace etiquette. It was about the future emotional architecture of the monarchy itself. And as tensions between ceremonial symbolism and actual palace power continued escalating behind closed doors, one chilling realization reportedly began spreading through Buckingham Palace corridors. The royal household was no longer operating as a unified institution. And once Catherine left the banquet, the palace could no longer contain the growing realization that the future king and queen might now be openly resisting Charles's inner circle. By midnight, the state banquet had transformed from a glittering diplomatic showcase into what one palace source allegedly described as a masterclass in royal damage control. Behind closed doors, aides were no longer discussing optics. They were discussing survival. The carefully constructed image of unity that Buckingham Palace had spent years protecting now appeared dangerously fragile, and according to insiders, the atmosphere inside royal circles had shifted from tension into outright alarm. Reports suggest international guests attending the banquet immediately sensed something had gone terribly wrong, even if few fully understood the cause. Diplomats reportedly exchanged cautious observations after noticing the abrupt disappearance of Catherine and the unusual behavior of senior palace officials throughout the evening. Some visitors allegedly described the royal mood as unnaturally cold, while others whispered that the emotional distance between certain members of the family had become impossible to ignore. For a monarchy built upon discipline, symbolism, and emotional restraint, even the smallest visible fracture carried enormous consequences. Palace staff were reportedly instructed within hours to avoid discussing Catherine's departure under any circumstances. According to sources familiar with internal communications, aides received direct warnings against speaking with journalists or even acknowledging that a significant disruption had taken place at all. But by then, the silence itself had already become suspicious. Different interpretations of the evening began spreading almost immediately across royal media circles, with correspondents hearing conflicting explanations from competing palace factions overnight. Some insiders allegedly attempted to portray the incident as a misunderstanding connected to exhaustion and scheduling stress. Others quietly hinted the situation involved something far deeper and more dangerous than public relations teams were prepared to admit. As the rumors intensified, attention reportedly shifted toward Kensington Palace, where William and Catherine were allegedly holding an emergency private discussion away from the chaos consuming Buckingham Palace. Sources close to palace staff claimed the atmosphere surrounding the couple that night was one of emotional devastation mixed with growing determination. Different interpretations suggest William felt blindsided not only by the revised ceremonial structure itself, but by the realization that critical decisions concerning the monarchy's future had potentially been concealed from him and Catherine until the final possible moment. That feeling of betrayal reportedly transformed the crisis from a disagreement into something intensely personal. Meanwhile, insiders whisper that King Charles III reacted with mounting frustration as the scale of the fallout became clearer. According to palace sources, the king was allegedly furious that internal disagreements had now spilled into public view during one of the monarchy's most diplomatically sensitive moments. For Charles, who had spent decades preparing to preserve stability after ascending the throne, the banquet controversy reportedly represented a humiliating collapse of royal discipline at precisely the wrong time. Yet, even as tensions escalated behind closed doors, competing narratives quickly emerged regarding Catherine's decision to leave. Supporters of Camilla allegedly framed Catherine's reaction as emotional, impulsive, and damaging to the institution during a period of national uncertainty. Some insiders quietly argued the Princess of Wales should have prioritized appearances and handled her concerns privately rather than allowing visible disruption to overshadow the evening. But supporters of Catherine reportedly viewed the situation very differently. According to sources close to the future queen, Catherine's actions were seen not as rebellion, but as an act of principle rooted in loyalty to what she believed the monarchy was supposed to represent. To them, her departure symbolized resistance against decisions that threatened the careful balance Queen Elizabeth II had spent decades protecting. That emotional divide only deepened the growing perception that the state banquet had become far more than an isolated royal scandal. It was now being viewed inside palace walls as the visible eruption of a larger succession-era struggle already reshaping the House of Windsor from within. And as officials scrambled desperately to contain the narrative before it spiraled beyond recovery, one haunting realization reportedly continued spreading through royal circles. The monarchy's greatest threat was no longer coming from outside criticism, but from internal fractures nobody could fully control anymore. King Charles III had spent decades waiting to shape the monarchy in his own image. But insiders whisper that the state banquet confrontation exposed a devastating reality. The crown he finally inherited was now pulling him in two irreconcilable directions. According to various interpretations circulating through palace circles, the king now found himself trapped between two deeply personal loyalties that could no longer peacefully coexist. On one side stood Camilla, the woman who had endured years of public hostility beside him, whose presence in his life had become inseparable from his emotional survival after decades of scandal, criticism, and loss. On the other stood William and Catherine, the future of the monarchy itself, the younger royal couple increasingly viewed not only by palace insiders but by the public as the institution's safest path toward long-term stability. Reports suggest the state banquet controversy forced Charles to confront a painful possibility he may have spent years trying to avoid, that protecting one side could now permanently damage the other. Palace insiders allegedly described the emotional atmosphere surrounding the king after Catherine's departure as one of exhaustion mixed with disbelief. Different interpretations suggest Charles initially believed the revised ceremonial arrangements would eventually be accepted quietly, even if concerns emerged privately behind closed doors. Instead, the backlash reportedly exposed tensions that had been building beneath the surface of the monarchy for years. Royal historians and commentators quickly began drawing comparisons to earlier crises that once shook the House of Windsor to its foundations, moments when loyalty, marriage, public image, and institutional duty collided with devastating consequences. Some insiders allegedly referenced the fractures surrounding Princess Diana during the 1990s, while others pointed to older royal struggles where personal relationships threatened to destabilize the carefully protected image of the crown itself. Yet, according to sources close to palace operations, what made this situation uniquely dangerous was timing. The monarchy was already navigating one of its most fragile eras in decades. Charles's health concerns continued generating uncertainty. Public trust in institutions remained delicate. Every royal appearance carried heightened scrutiny. And now, insiders claim the visible suggestion of internal division threatened to weaken the very sense of continuity the monarchy depended upon to survive. Palace officials reportedly feared the public fallout would not remain confined to gossip or temporary headlines. Because once questions about unity begin surrounding the crown, those doubts can quietly grow into larger questions about leadership, succession, and legitimacy. Meanwhile, Catherine's standing within public perception reportedly continued strengthening in the aftermath of the banquet. According to royal commentators, many observers increasingly viewed her not simply as the Princess of Wales, but as the emotional center of the monarchy's future. Her years of discipline, restraint, and loyalty had allegedly earned her a level of trust few modern royals ever achieved. That growing influence reportedly became a major point of discussion within palace circles after the incident. Some insiders even began questioning whether Charles and his advisors had underestimated how strongly the public identified Catherine with stability itself. At the same time, reports suggest William's frustration deepened significantly after the revelations surrounding the revised ceremonial structure. Allies close to the future king allegedly described his anger not as impulsive outrage, but as mounting distrust toward what they privately called clandestine decision-making occurring around the king's inner circle. Different interpretations suggest William became increasingly concerned that critical matters affecting the monarchy's future were being managed without transparency or consultation, creating dangerous fractures inside the institution during an already vulnerable period. The contrast between past triumph and present tension reportedly haunted many within the royal household. Commentators frequently referenced the sun-drenched coronation of 2023, a moment intended to symbolize unity, renewal, and continuity after the death of Queen Elizabeth II. Yet now, only a short time later, that hopeful image seemed overshadowed by an atmosphere insiders allegedly described as icy, uncertain, and emotionally fractured. Because beneath the ceremonial tradition and polished public appearances, the monarchy now faced difficult internal questions about duty, hierarchy, influence, and legacy that nobody inside Buckingham Palace appeared fully prepared to answer. Within 48 hours, Buckingham Palace reportedly launched what insiders called a containment operation. Calls were made, briefings were adjusted, loyal aides moved quickly to stop the narrative from spiraling into a full-scale royal legitimacy crisis. According to various interpretations from palace insiders, the atmosphere behind closed doors had become increasingly strategic, almost militarized in its urgency, as senior officials realized the state banquet controversy was no longer simply a family disagreement. It had evolved into a dangerous battle over perception, symbolism, and institutional control during one of the monarchy's most fragile periods in decades. Reports suggest communications teams inside Buckingham Palace immediately began attempting to soften public understanding of Catherine's departure by presenting the evening as emotionally overstated media speculation rather than evidence of a serious internal rupture. Palace representatives allegedly emphasized routine scheduling complications, exhaustion, and the pressures of royal life in private conversations with journalists. But insiders whisper those efforts quickly collided with a far more difficult reality. Too many people inside royal circles already knew something profound had shifted. Different interpretations of the fallout suggest competing factions within the royal household began leaking conflicting versions of events almost immediately. Some sources quietly framed Catherine's reaction as deeply personal, portraying the Princess of Wales as emotionally overwhelmed by ceremonial changes that were supposedly administrative rather than political. Other palace voices allegedly pushed back aggressively, insisting the revised coronation structure represented a significant institutional shift that William and Catherine had every reason to question. As contradictory narratives flooded royal media circles, confusion only intensified. Yet, behind the competing leaks and carefully managed statements, insiders claim a larger alignment was quietly strengthening around William and Catherine. According to palace whispers, allies close to the future king and queen increasingly focused on presenting the couple not as rebellious figures, but as guardians of institutional stability during a period of dangerous uncertainty. Sources suggest their supporters viewed the controversy through a much broader lens than a single banquet dispute. To them, the issue centered on protecting continuity, preserving public trust, and preventing the monarchy from drifting into what they allegedly feared could become a fragmented system of competing influence networks around the king. Meanwhile, Camilla's circle reportedly worked just as aggressively to defend the revised ceremonial structure. Different interpretations suggest her supporters describe the changes as a misunderstood effort to modernize the monarchy in ways that reflected contemporary royal realities rather than outdated hierarchy. Some insiders allegedly argued that resistance from William and Catherine's side revealed a deeper unwillingness within parts of the institution to fully accept Camilla's evolving role after years of public rehabilitation and sacrifice beside Charles. But even as those arguments circulated privately, reports indicate the emotional atmosphere inside palace operations was becoming increasingly divided. Courtiers who once maintained careful neutrality allegedly began gravitating toward one side or the other, creating what some insiders described as an emerging heirs accord atmosphere around William and Catherine. The phrase reportedly reflected growing recognition among senior staff that the monarchy's long-term future would eventually depend upon the younger royal couple's ability to restore public confidence after years of turbulence, scandal, and uncertainty. According to palace sources, some senior officials had already begun quietly preparing for an eventual transition of power long before the banquet controversy erupted. But Catherine's walkout reportedly accelerated those conversations dramatically. Royal commentators, British tabloids, and international outlets exploded with speculation almost overnight, transforming palace whispers into a global obsession. Every royal appearance, every silence, every carefully managed statement suddenly carried hidden meaning. And while official channels attempted desperately to project calm, public sympathy reportedly leaned heavily toward Catherine. Many observers viewed her not as disruptive, but as principled, a future queen reacting to decisions she believed threatened the monarchy's balance and integrity. That perception, insiders claim, deeply alarmed certain palace figures because it suggested public loyalty might already be shifting emotionally toward the next generation of royal leadership. And despite every effort to restore calm, the image of Catherine leaving the banquet hall had already become impossible for the monarchy to erase. Long after the banquet candles burned out and the palace corridors fell silent, one image continued haunting the monarchy: Catherine walking away while generations of royal portraits watched from the walls above her. According to palace insiders, that single moment quickly transformed into something much larger than an emotional reaction at a royal gathering. It became a symbol, a dividing line, a silent declaration that the future direction of the monarchy was no longer universally agreed upon behind Buckingham Palace walls. Reports suggest senior members of the royal household understood almost immediately that the walkout would not fade quietly into history as a temporary controversy. Instead, it appeared to crystallize years of hidden tension surrounding identity, loyalty, and the future emotional structure of the crown itself. Different interpretations began emerging across royal circles, but one theme reportedly united them all. The monarchy was entering a deeply uncertain chapter where symbolism mattered more than ever before. To many observers, Catherine increasingly came to represent the continuation of Queen Elizabeth II's philosophy of duty, restraint, and disciplined stability. Her years of careful silence, relentless public composure, and commitment to royal responsibility allegedly earned her extraordinary trust both inside palace operations and among the public. Following the banquet controversy, insiders whisper that Catherine's image shifted from future queen to institutional protector, someone many now view as safeguarding the balance the late queen spent decades preserving. That growing perception reportedly carried enormous emotional consequences for King Charles III. According to various interpretations from palace figures, Charles now faced the painful realization that the